The twin moons hung low in the purple twilight sky, casting an ethereal glow over the towering spires of Xena's home. From the highest balcony of the Therox estate, the capital city stretched out like a sea of shimmering lights, each gleaming tower competing for dominance in a skyline that never slept. Xena gazed out over it, her hand resting lightly on the cool, crystalline railing, her thoughts clouded by anticipation. Today was her birthday, her 20th, and in her world, a milestone like no other. Inside the estate, the grand halls were filled with opulence, adorned with priceless artifacts from across the galaxy, relics of her family's conquest. The Therox family wasn't just powerful, they were the power in this galaxy. For centuries, their influence had stretched across entire star systems, ruling with an iron fist beneath a veneer of elegance and sophistication. Xena had been raised to understand that her family's dominance was not only her birthright but the natural order of things. And yet, as the delicate notes of a far-off orchestra filtered through the air from the ballroom below, Xena felt a peculiar sense of unease. This year, there had been a strange tension in her parents' words, a cryptic tone to the conversation she had overheard between servants and dignitaries. She had always been given what she wanted, even things she had never dreamed of asking for. But this year it felt different, heavier, somehow. The doors behind her slid open with a soft whoosh, and Xena turned to see Kyra, her closest friend and confidante, entering with a smile that only partially masked her own nervous energy. "They're ready for you," Kyra said, her voice light, but there was something in her eyes that flickered with uncertainty. Xena brushed a stray lock of silver hair behind her ear and sighed. "Isn't it strange, Kyra? I should be excited. I've been given every possible luxury, every conceivable gift over the years. But tonight, I don't know, something feels off." Kyra laughed softly, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "You worry too much? Your parents wouldn't let anything spoil your birthday, Xena. Come on, let's see what they've prepared this time." Perhaps it's another starship, or Kyra's teasing tone faltered, or something even more extravagant. Xena nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling gnawing at her. Together they left the balcony and descended the grand spiral staircase that led to the lower halls of the estate. As they approached the ballroom, the sounds of the orchestra grew louder, and the laughter and murmured conversations of the elite socialites who had gathered for the evening filled the air. The ballroom was a spectacle of wealth and power. Glowing chandeliers made of rare luminescent crystals hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting rainbows of light across the polished obsidian floors. Guests clad in shimmering fabrics from distant worlds mingled in clusters, sipping on sparkling drinks from delicate glasses. But as Xena entered, the buzz of conversation quieted, and all eyes turned toward her. Her father, Lord Therox, stood at the center of the room, an imposing figure draped in dark, ornate robes that reflected his status as ruler of the Therox Empire. His sharp features and calculating eyes bore the same expression of cool control that had always unnerved Xena. At his side, her mother, Lady Therox, smiled warmly, though Xena could tell it was a smile of expectation, not affection. "Ah, there she is," her father's voice echoed across the ballroom as he gestured for her to come forward. "The star of the evening." Xena moved toward them, trying to shake off the unease that still clung to her like a shadow. She smiled, but it felt practiced, more for the benefit of the guests than out of any real joy. As she reached the center of the room, her father gave a nod to one of the attendants standing at the far side of the hall. The attendant moved quickly, opening a large door that led to a side chamber, and the room fell completely silent. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his hands bound in sleek, metallic cuffs that gleamed under the chandeliers. Xena's breath caught in her throat. The man's skin was different from hers, warmer, more alive, and his eyes, deep and intense, seemed to bore into her even as he was led forward. His dark hair fell messily over his forehead, and though his clothes were simple, there was something undeniably human about the way he held himself, proud and unyielding despite the circumstances. The room's temperature seemed to drop, and Xena could feel the tension thickening around her as whispers spread through the guests. "A human? A human?" Her father's voice cut through the silence. "Xena, my dear, as you come of age, it is time for you to receive a gift unlike any other. Behold, this human Leo, as he is called, brought from the distant planet Earth. A rare and fascinating creature, full of curiosity and strength. He is yours now." Xena's heart raced as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. She had read about humans in books, seen holo images of them, but they were always portrayed as little more than primitive beasts, unsophisticated and dangerous. It was said that their emotions ran wild, unchecked by logic or control, and that they were driven by instincts that made them unpredictable. To be given a human as a gift, a living being, was shocking, unsettling even. Father. She stammered, glancing between Leo and her parents. Her mother stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. He is yours to command, Xena, to serve you as you see fit, a rare treasure from the stars. Leo's gaze never wavered from hers, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink around them. There was no fear in his eyes, only defiance, a quiet strength that made Xena's chest tighten. This was no wild animal. He was intelligent, aware more so than any of the guests who now gawked at him like an exotic pet. Xena swallowed hard, her mind spinning. Thank you, she managed, though the words felt hollow in her mouth. I'm honored. Her father's expression remained cold, but satisfied. Good. He will be housed in your quarters and attend to your every need. He is yours now. Treat him well or not, as you see fit. As the murmurs of approval filled the room, Xena felt a sudden urge to escape the suffocating atmosphere. She turned, gesturing for Kyra to follow her as she made her way back up the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel Leo's presence behind her, following silently as instructed. Once they reached her private chambers, Xena stopped, breathing heavily. Her hands trembled as she tried to process the weight of what had just happened. A human? A gift? Kyra, too, seemed shaken, though she quickly masked her surprise with a nervous smile. Well, that was unexpected. Xena let out a shaky breath, pacing back and forth. They brought me a human, Kyra, a living, breathing person. I don't even know how to. What am I supposed to do with him? Kyra shrugged, though her eyes flickered toward Leo, who stood silently at the entrance to the chamber. I suppose. Whatever you want. He's yours now, isn't he? Xena glanced at Leo, and for the first time she truly looked at him. His eyes were dark, intelligent, and unwavering as they met hers. There was no fear in his expression, only a quiet resistance that unsettled her even more than his presence. She turned to him, her voice hesitant. Leo, is that your name? He nodded once but said nothing. The silence between them was heavy, and Xena felt a strange discomfort she couldn't quite place. She had been given servants her whole life, automatons, bioengineered creatures, even alien species bred for service. But this was different. Leo was different. Do you understand why you're here? Xena asked, her voice softer now. Leo's lips parted, and his voice, deep and measured, filled the room. I understand enough. You don't need to pretend, princess. I know what I am to you. His words stung, though Xena wasn't sure why. There was a bitterness to them, a sharp edge that cut through the formalities of their situation. She had expected obedience, silence, but not this, not defiance. Xena opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. She had no idea what to say to him. What could she say? She was the daughter of the most powerful family in the galaxy, and he was by all accounts a gift. And yet, standing before him, Xena felt the first stirrings of doubt. This was not how she had imagined her birthday. This was not a gift she had ever asked for. Kyra cleared her throat, sensing the tension. Maybe it's best if we leave you to rest, Xena. It's been a long night. Xena nodded, grateful for the escape. Yes, perhaps that's best. As Kyra left, Xena remained standing in the center of the room, staring at Leo. He stood still, his expression unreadable, though his eyes spoke volumes. She didn't know what to do with him, didn't know how to feel about him. But one thing was certain: this was no ordinary gift. And something told her that, from this moment on, nothing in her life would ever be the same again. In the silence of her chambers, Xena sat down, her mind racing with questions she had never thought to ask. What was Leo's life like before he was brought here? How had he been captured? And most pressing of all, what did it mean to own another being who seemed so much like her, yet so different? As the night deepened, Xena couldn't help but wonder, had her family ever told her the truth about anything at all? The days following Xena's birthday were marked by a disquieting sense of change. It was as though her life, once predictable and controlled, had suddenly developed cracks through which uncertainty seeped in like an unstoppable tide. The gift of a human Leo had become a silent presence that she could neither ignore nor fully understand. And though he had been presented to her as something to own, she found herself reluctant to act, as if that were true. Leo had been moved to a section of her private quarters, a spacious wing of the estate with high windows that overlooked the glittering city below. Her chambers, usually a sanctuary of calm and luxury, now felt charged with tension, an invisible boundary dividing her world from his. Though their interactions had been minimal, Xena found herself constantly thinking about him. She had never encountered anyone like Leo before, a being who, despite being given to her as property, radiated a sense of independence and quiet strength. Each day, Xena would sit by her window, staring out at the sprawling city, while her mind wandered back to Leo's words on the night of her birthday. "I know what I am to you." His voice had been calm, but the bitterness underneath those words lingered like an unanswered question. She found herself wrestling with emotions she couldn't name. Curiosity, guilt, and something else, something unspoken and uneasy. She was supposed to give orders, to make use of this gift as her father had suggested. But the very idea of commanding Leo, of treating him like a servant or a tool, felt wrong. Her father had praised her for her calm, rational demeanor, for her willingness to accept her place in the family's hierarchy. But how could she reconcile that with the presence of someone like Leo, who seemed to defy every expectation she'd ever had? It wasn't long before her curiosity overcame her hesitation. Xena entered the room where Leo had been staying, her steps tentative, as if crossing into unfamiliar territory. The chamber was elegantly appointed, as all rooms in the estate were, with sleek, minimalist furniture and a wide window that bathed the space in soft light. But despite its beauty, the room felt like a gilded cage, sterile and confining. Leo sat by the window, his back to the door, staring out at the city skyline. He didn't turn when she entered, though Xena knew he was aware of her presence. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of how to begin. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken thoughts. "Leo," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "We haven't spoken much since that night. I thought we might talk." He turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting hers. There was no expression on his face, no hint of emotion, just a quiet, measured gaze that made Xena's heart race for reasons she didn't quite understand. "Talk," he repeated, as though testing the word. "What would you like to talk about, princess?" Xena flinched slightly at the way he said princess, as if it were a title that distanced them rather than connected them. She had never thought much about her status before, but in Leo's presence it felt like a barrier, something insurmountable between them. "I'm not sure," she admitted, stepping further into the room. I've never met a human before." A faint smile tugged at the corner of Leo's mouth, though there was no warmth in it. "And I've never been in a palace before, so I suppose we're both new to this." Xena couldn't help but smile at the wryness of his tone, though her discomfort lingered. She moved to sit in a chair opposite him, trying to appear composed even as her mind raced with questions. "They say humans are dangerous," she said, choosing her words carefully. "That you're unpredictable, driven by emotion rather than reason. Is that true?" Leo leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Dangerous? Unpredictable?" He let out a dry laugh. "Maybe that's what they tell you, but I could say the same about your people. From what I've seen, you're the ones who steal others from their homes, cage them like animals, and call it civilization." Xena's cheeks flushed, though she wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment or anger. "I didn't," she stopped herself, realizing she had no response that would sound anything but hollow. "I didn't choose this." Leo's gaze softened slightly, though his expression remained guarded. "I know," he said quietly, "but you're part of it, aren't you? This empire of yours. It's built on the backs of those like me. You've been taught to see us as less than you, primitive and savage." He shook his head. "But I assure you, princess, we are just as capable of reason as you are, maybe more so." Xena felt a pang of guilt rise in her chest. He wasn't wrong. Everything she had been taught since childhood had been designed to reinforce her family's superiority, to make her believe that their rule was not only justified but natural. The galaxy was full of species her people had subjugated, and humans were just one among many. But Leo, this human, didn't fit into the neat categories she had been taught. She shifted in her seat, trying to find the right words. "Then, what is Earth like?" she asked, hoping to steer the conversation away from the uncomfortable truth of her world. "I've read about it, but the records are limited." Leo studied her for a long moment before answering, as though deciding how much he should share. Earth, he said, his voice distant, is a place of contradictions. Beautiful and harsh. There are cities that stretch as far as the eye can see, filled with people from every walk of life. But there are also wild places, forests, mountains, oceans that make you feel small in the best way. Humans, my people, were complex. We can be compassionate, we can be cruel. But we're always fighting for something: survival, freedom, each other. Xena listened intently, captivated by the way he spoke of his home. It sounded so different from her world, where everything was controlled, orderly, and sterile. The wildness he described intrigued her, though it also frightened her. She had always been taught to fear the chaos of unbridled nature, the unpredictability of beings who acted on emotion. And you, she asked softly, leaning forward, what did you fight for? For the first time, a shadow passed over Leo's face, and his gaze dropped to the floor. His jaw tightened, and Xena realized she had touched on something painful. I fought to live, he said quietly. I fought to live, he said quietly. I fought to protect my family. But that was before they came for me. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words pressing down on both of them. Xena wanted to ask more, to pry into the details of his past, but something held her back. The pain in his voice was too raw, too real, and she wasn't sure she had the right to ask. I'm sorry, she said at last, though the words felt inadequate. Leo looked at her, his eyes hard but not unkind. Are you, he asked, his voice low, or are you just saying that because you don't know what else to say? Xena flinched, but she didn't look away. I don't know, she admitted. I've never had to think about these things before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the city below was the only sound that filled the room. Xena felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted, leaving her unmoored. She had grown up in a world of absolutes, where her place in the hierarchy was unquestionable, where the rules of power and dominance were clear. But Leo, his very existence, was challenging everything she thought she knew. Finally, Leo stood, walking to the window and looking out over the city. His voice, when he spoke again, was softer, less accusatory. You're not like the others, he said, almost to himself. The way you look at me, it's different. Xena blinked, startled by his words. Different how? Leo turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers with a piercing intensity. You're curious. You don't see me as just a thing. Not like they do. You're trying to understand, even if you don't realize it. Xena felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest at his words, though she wasn't sure why. She had always prided herself on being intelligent, thoughtful, but to hear it from Leo, of all people, felt different. It felt like he was seeing something in her that she hadn't even seen in herself. I don't know what I'm supposed to do, she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. I've never questioned any of this before. Leo's expression softened, and for the first time since they had met, he seemed to let his guard down, if only slightly. Maybe that's a start, he said, asking questions, not just about me, but about everything. Xena swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling deep in her mind. She had spent her entire life following the path laid out for her, never once stopping to ask why. But now, standing before Leo, she felt as though a door had been opened, one that she couldn't close, even if she wanted to. She stood slowly, joining him at the window, her gaze drifting out over the city. Do you miss it? She asked after a long pause. Earth, I mean. Leo's eyes darkened, and for a moment, Xena thought she saw a flicker of pain there. Every day, he said quietly, but I'll never see it again. Not while I'm here. Xena felt a pang of guilt at his words, and she realized, for the first time, just how deep the injustice of his situation ran. He hadn't just been taken from his home, he had been taken from everything. His family, his life, his world. And now he was hers. Xena turned to him, her voice trembling slightly. I don't know what I can do to make this right, she said, her words coming out faster than she intended. But I don't want you to feel like a prisoner, not here. Leo's gaze softened, though his expression remained guarded. You can't change what's been done, Xena, he said gently. But maybe you can change what happens next. The weight of his words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Xena felt the walls of her world shifting, the boundaries she had always accepted beginning to blur. She didn't know what was happening between her and Leo, but she knew one thing for certain: this was only the beginning. As she looked out over the city, The shimmering lights below seemed less comforting than they once had, as though the truth lurking beneath them was waiting to be uncovered. And in that moment, Xena made a decision, a quiet, unspoken vow. She would find a way to make things right, not just for Leo but for herself. Because for the first time in her life, Xena wasn't sure if she truly belonged in the world she had always known. As the night deepened, Xena and Leo stood side by side, two people from worlds that were never meant to collide, yet bound together by forces they couldn't fully understand. And in the silence of that shared moment, something shifted between them, a fragile connection, built not on power or ownership, but on the simple, undeniable truth of their shared humanity. But in the shadows beyond the window, the galaxy remained vast, cold, and indifferent. And as Xena's heart began to open, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come. The days that followed Xena's quiet vow were filled with a tension that simmered just beneath the surface of her life. It was a tension no one around her seemed to notice, but one that pressed against her mind constantly. Every step she took through the opulent halls of her family's estate, every conversation with her parents, every lavish dinner and social gathering, it all felt like a hollow performance now. As if, somehow, she was playing a part in a script she no longer believed in. Her conversations with Leo had grown more frequent, each one peeling back the layers of the world she had always taken for granted. In the beginning, her curiosity had driven her to speak with him, to learn about Earth, about humans. But now it was more than that. Xena found herself looking forward to their talks, seeking out his company, not just to satisfy her curiosity, but because she felt seen in a way she never had before. Leo didn't look at her as a Therox, or as the daughter of the most powerful family in the galaxy. He saw her as Xena. It was intoxicating and dangerous. One evening, as dusk fell and the twin moons began their slow ascent into the sky, Xena found herself once again standing outside Leo's chambers. Her hand hovered over the control panel by the door, hesitating. She had been spending so much time with him lately that even Kyra had begun to raise her eyebrows in subtle concern. Xena knew she was pushing boundaries. In her world, people like Leo were considered tools, possessions, gifts. And yet, the idea of treating him that way now seemed abhorrent. Finally, she pressed the panel, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Leo was seated by the window as he often was, his back to the door, gazing out at the darkening sky. He didn't turn as she entered, though she knew he was aware of her presence. Xena walked across the room and took a seat opposite him, studying his profile in the fading light. There was a stillness about him, a quiet strength that she found herself admiring more and more. He had endured so much, yet he remained unbroken. "Leo," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. He turned then, his eyes meeting hers with that same steady intensity that always unsettled her, though she couldn't say why. "Xena," he replied, his voice calm, though there was a hint of something in it, something unspoken. They sat in silence for a moment, the air between them thick with unvoiced thoughts. "I've been thinking," Xena began, her fingers tracing the edge of the armrest, "about what you said, about freedom, and how wrong this is." Leo's expression didn't change, but she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or hope, buried deep beneath his guarded exterior. "And what have you decided?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Xena hesitated, her mind racing. She had spent countless hours agonizing over what to do, weighing the consequences of her growing rebellion against the world she had always known. But the more time she spent with Leo, the clearer it became that she couldn't continue living this lie. The more she saw the galaxy through his eyes, the more she realized how blind she had been to its injustices. "I want to help you," she said, her voice firmer now. "I want to help you get out of here. You don't deserve to be trapped like this. No one does." For the first time, Leo's calm facade cracked. His eyes widened slightly, and he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Xena, do you know what you're saying?" She nodded, her resolve hardening. "I do. I know what my family would do if they found out, but I can't just stand by and do nothing. I can't pretend that this is normal or that it's okay. Not anymore." Leo stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and intense. "You're risking everything. If your father finds out." "I know," Xena interrupted, her heart pounding. "I know the risks. But I don't care. I can't live in this cage any longer, Leo. I thought I had everything, but now I see how empty it all is. My family's power, Their control, it's all built on lies and oppression. I don't want to be part of that anymore." Leo was silent, his gaze searching hers as though trying to gauge her sincerity. Finally, he let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "If you do this," he said quietly, "there's no going back. Once you help me escape, you'll be defying everything your family stands for. They won't forgive that." Xena swallowed hard, her pulse racing. She knew the truth of his words. Her family, especially her father, would see any act of rebellion as the highest form of treason. The Therox Empire thrived on control, on maintaining the status quo at all costs. If she helped Leo, if she chose to break away from her family's legacy, she would be throwing herself into a world of uncertainty. She would be giving up everything she had ever known. But the alternative, doing nothing, allowing Leo to remain a prisoner, was unthinkable. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I don't know what the future holds, but I can't keep living this way. I want to be free too." Leo's eyes softened, and for a moment, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding, a shared resolve. "Then we'll do it," he said. "But we have to be smart about it. Your family is watching. If we're caught..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Xena knew what the consequences would be. But despite the fear that gnawed at her, she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. For the first time in her life, she was making a choice, her choice, not one dictated by her family or their expectations. And that, more than anything, gave her strength. The plan came together slowly, in stolen moments and whispered conversations. Xena and Leo were careful, always mindful of the ever-watchful eyes of her family's security forces. They spoke in code, using seemingly innocent phrases to discuss their escape, and Xena made subtle preparations, gathering supplies and information without arousing suspicion. As the days passed, Xena's heart raced with a mix of anticipation and fear. Every time she passed her father in the grand halls of the estate, she felt as though he could see straight through her, as if he knew exactly what she was planning. But Lord Therox remained as cold and distant as ever, his sharp eyes focused on the affairs of the Empire, rather than his daughter's growing rebellion. Kyra, however, was not so easily fooled. One evening, as Xena was returning to her chambers after yet another secret meeting with Leo, she found Kyra waiting for her in the corridor. Her friend's face was pale, her usually bright eyes clouded with worry. "Xena," Kyra said, her voice hushed, "what are you doing?" Xena froze, her pulse quickening. "What do you mean?" Kyra glanced around, ensuring they were alone, before stepping closer. "You've been spending so much time with him," she whispered, her tone urgent. "The human. People are starting to talk. They say you're changing." Xena's heart pounded in her chest. She hadn't realized how obvious her growing attachment to Leo had become, but of course Kyra would notice. They had been friends for years, and Kyra knew her better than anyone. "I'm not changing," Xena said, though even she didn't believe the words as they left her mouth. "I'm just curious." Kyra's brow furrowed. "Xena, you're playing with fire. Your father, he won't tolerate this. If he finds out that you're..." She lowered her voice further, her eyes wide with fear. "That you're sympathizing with him, with a human." The dim light of the twin moons filtered through the high, arched windows of Xena's chambers, casting long shadows that danced across the floor. The silence in the room was thick, oppressive, punctuated only by the distant hum of the city below. Xena sat by the window, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She had been confined to her chambers for days, her every movement monitored, every attempt at communication cut off. Darren's presence outside her door was constant, a silent reminder that she was no longer free, even in her own home. Her father's punishment for her defiance had been swift and unrelenting, but it was the threat against Leo that weighed most heavily on her. Every moment spent in this gilded cage was a reminder of the terrible consequences that hung over them both. She had been so close to helping him escape, to breaking free from the suffocating grip of her family's control. But now, everything had unraveled, and Leo was still trapped, just like her. Xena rose from her seat, pacing the room in frustration. The cool, smooth floor beneath her feet did little to soothe the turmoil that churned inside her. How had it come to this? She had always known her family's power was absolute, but until now, she had never truly understood the price of defying it. Her thoughts kept circling back to Leo. She hadn't seen him since her father's confrontation. What were they doing to him? Was he still being watched, guarded as closely as she was, the idea of him locked away, helpless, sent a sharp pang of guilt and fear through her chest. She had to find a way out. For both of them. It was late into the night when Xena finally made her decision. The house was quiet, the usual sounds of servants and guards reduced to a whisper as the estate settled into its nightly routine. She had been watching the patterns of the guards for days, studying their rotations, memorizing the moments when the estate was at its most vulnerable. Now was her chance. Taking a deep breath, Xena approached the door to her chambers, her pulse racing in her ears. She could hear Darren's faint footsteps pacing outside, a reminder that her father's trusted officer was never far away. But she had prepared for this. Over the past few days, Xena had discovered a hidden access panel in her chambers, a secret passage that led to the lower levels of the estate. It had been installed centuries ago as a safeguard for the Therox family in case of an emergency. Xena had never needed to use it before, but tonight it was her only way out. She moved swiftly to the far corner of the room, where the smooth, seamless wall concealed the panel. Her fingers brushed over the hidden control, and with a soft click, a section of the wall slid open, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor beyond. Xena hesitated for only a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, before stepping inside and closing the panel behind her. The passageway was cold and silent, the air heavy with the musty scent of disuse. It stretched on in a narrow, winding path that twisted through the bowels of the estate, leading to the forgotten service tunnels below. Xena moved quickly, her footsteps light, her senses alert. She didn't know how much time she had before someone noticed her absence, but every second was precious. Her mind raced with the details of her plan. She had been working on this for days, ever since her confinement had begun. The security systems in the lower levels were more lax, designed for maintenance staff rather than guarding high-profile prisoners. If she could make it to the lower levels, she could reach Leo's chambers, deactivate the remaining security measures, and get him out. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was the only chance they had. As she neared the end of the passage, Xena could feel her pulse quicken with a mixture of fear and hope. The corridor opened into a small maintenance room, empty save for a few outdated control panels and stacks of unused equipment. She crossed the room in a few swift steps, approaching the door that led into the lower levels. Before she could reach it, however, the door slid open with a soft hiss. Xena froze. Standing in the doorway was Darren, his tall, imposing figure blocking her path. His expression was unreadable, his eyes cold and focused. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Xena's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she tried to think of a way out, a way to explain her presence here. But before she could speak, Darren stepped aside, his gaze fixed on her. "I've disabled the sensors," he said quietly, his voice low and even. "You have 10 minutes before the next patrol." Xena blinked, stunned into silence. For a moment she didn't understand what he was saying, couldn't comprehend why Darren of all people would help her. He had been her father's loyal officer for as long as she could remember, a man who followed orders without question. And yet here he was, offering her an escape. Why, she whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Darren's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something almost like regret. "I served your father because I believed in what he stood for. But I see now that I was wrong. This system, this world we've built, it's rotten to the core." He stepped back, his gaze intense. "You want to free the human? Then do it. But you need to be fast." Xena stared at him for a long moment, her mind struggling to process what was happening. This was her chance, the opportunity she had been waiting for. But Darren's sudden change of heart left her with more questions than answers. Still, she couldn't waste time. Nodding once, Xena slipped past him, her heart racing as she hurried down the corridor toward Leo's chambers. The lower levels were dimly lit, the sterile walls lined with security cameras and reinforced doors. But true to Darren's word, the sensors had been disabled, and the cameras remained dark as Xena moved swiftly through the halls. She reached Leo's chamber in minutes, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts as she approached the door. Her fingers trembled as she entered the override code into the control panel, and with a soft beep, the door slid open. Inside, Leo was sitting on the edge of the bed, his posture tense, his gaze fixed on the door as it opened. The moment he saw Xena, his eyes widened with surprise and relief. Xena, he breathed, standing quickly. How did you? There's no time, she interrupted, her voice urgent. We need to leave. Now. Leo's expression hardened, his gaze flicking to the door behind her. What happened? Did your father? I'll explain later, she said, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the door. We have to go. I've deactivated the security systems, but we don't have much time. Leo didn't argue. He followed her out of the chamber, his grip firm, but gentle as they moved through the dimly lit halls together. The weight of their situation hung heavy between them, unspoken but ever present. They were running for their lives, and every second counted. As they neared the exit to the lower levels, Xena's heart raced with a mixture of fear and hope. She could see the faint glow of the maintenance room ahead, the final checkpoint before they reached the outer corridors of the estate. If they could just make it past that point, they would be free. But as they rounded the corner, Xena's breath caught in her throat. Standing at the entrance to the maintenance room was a group of guards, 4 of them, their weapons drawn, their eyes cold and focused. Darren stood among them, his expression unreadable, as he locked eyes with Xena. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Xena's heart pounded in her ears, her mind racing with disbelief. Had Darren betrayed her? Was this all part of some twisted plan to trap her and Leo? Before she could react, Darren raised his hand, signaling the guards to lower their weapons. Go, he said quietly, his voice calm but urgent. The guards won't follow you. Xena stared at him, her pulse racing. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Darren's expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of something almost like regret in his eyes. Because I've seen what your family is capable of, and I don't want to be part of it anymore. Xena swallowed hard, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions, but there was no time to ask them. She could see the faint light of the outer corridors beyond the guards, the path to freedom just within reach. Without another word, she grabbed Leo's hand and ran. The outer corridors of the estate were eerily quiet, the usual bustle of servants and guards replaced by the stillness of the night. Xena's heart pounded in her chest as she and Leo sprinted through the halls, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. She could feel the weight of her father's influence pressing down on her, a constant reminder that they were still deep within enemy territory. But she couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. As they neared the exit to the estate's private hangar, Xena's mind raced with the details of their plan. They had a stolen ship waiting for them, a small, agile craft designed for quick getaways. If they could just reach it, they would have a chance of escaping the estate, of leaving this life behind. But even as they approached the hangar doors, Xena knew that their escape wouldn't be easy. Her father's reach extended far beyond the walls of the estate, and once they were in open space, they would be hunted. The Therox family didn't forgive traitors, and Xena was now, by every definition, a traitor. As the hangar doors slid open, Xena caught sight of the ship, its sleek, dark frame gleaming under the harsh lights of the docking bay. Relief flooded through her, and for the first time since this harrowing night had begun, she allowed herself to believe that they might actually make it out. But as they approached the ship, a voice rang out from behind them, stopping Xena in her tracks. Xena. She froze. Turning slowly, Xena saw her father standing at the entrance to the hangar, his imposing figure silhouetted against the pale light. His face was calm, composed, but his eyes burned with a cold fury that made Xena's blood run cold. You think you can escape me, Lord Therox's voice was low, dangerous. You think you can run from your own blood. Xena's heart pounded in her chest, her mind racing as she faced the man who had controlled her life for so long. The man who had shaped her into what she was, and who was now determined to destroy her for defying him. I'm not running, Xena said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. I'm choosing my own path. Lord Therox's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the air between them crackled with unspoken tension. Then, with a sudden, sharp motion, he raised his hand, signaling the guards that had gathered behind him. Xena's breath caught in her throat as she realized what was happening. This was it, the final confrontation, the moment she had feared, but also prepared for. She had no choice. Turning to Leo, she grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the ship. Get in, she said, her voice urgent. We don't have time. Leo hesitated for only a moment before nodding, following her into the cockpit. Xena's hands trembled as she activated the ship's controls, her mind racing as the engines roared to life. Outside, she could see her father's guards closing in, their weapons drawn, their eyes fixed on the ship. But even as they moved closer, Xena felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. This was her choice, her decision, and she would see it through to the end. As the ship lifted off the ground, Xena glanced back one last time, her gaze locking with her father's. His face was a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with a hatred that chilled her to the bone. But she didn't look away. She met his gaze head-on, her heart filled with a fierce, unyielding resolve. She was no longer his daughter. She was no longer part of the Therox Empire. She was free. With a final, defiant glance, Xena turned her attention back to the controls, guiding the ship out of the hangar and into the vast, endless expanse of space. They were free. But at what cost? As the stars stretched out before them, Xena and Leo sat in silence, the weight of their escape pressing down on them both. The galaxy was vast and their future was uncertain. But for the first time in her life, Xena felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. They had paid a high price for their freedom, but they had it. And now, whatever came next, they would face it together. But in the cold, distant reaches of space, the Therox Empire would not rest. Lord Therox's power stretched far and wide, and Xena knew that this was only the beginning. Their escape had marked them as fugitives, and the hunt was far from over. The price of freedom was steep, but Xena was willing to pay it. For herself, for Het, and for Leo. The ship hurtled through the vast, star-streaked expanse of space, its engines humming with a quiet intensity. Xena sat at the helm, her hands gripping the controls with white-knuckled tension as they moved farther away from her father's empire, deeper into the unknown reaches of the galaxy. Leo sat beside her, silent but watchful, his presence a steadying force, amid the storm of emotions that roiled within her. They were free, but the word felt hollow. The momentary exhilaration of their escape had been replaced by a weighty sense of uncertainty. Xena's entire life had been shattered in a single night. She had severed ties with her family, betrayed the most powerful empire in the galaxy, and thrown herself into a future she couldn't predict. And yet, despite the fear and the doubt gnawing at her, she felt an undeniable sense of rightness in what she had done. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the low hum of the ship's systems. Finally, Xena spoke, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We did it." Leo glanced over at her, his expression calm but serious. "We're not out of danger yet," he said. "Your father's reach extends far beyond his estate. He'll come after us." Xena nodded, her chest tightening at the thought of her father's inevitable pursuit. She knew Leo was right. The Therox family would not forgive her betrayal, and her father, cold, calculating Lord Therox, would stop at nothing to bring her back under his control, or to destroy her. But despite the looming threat, Xena felt a strange sense of relief settle over her. She had made her choice. She had defied her father, and now, for the first time in her life, she was forging her own path. "We need to find a safe place to hide," Leo continued, his voice steady. "Somewhere your father's influence doesn't reach. There are colonies on the outskirts of the galaxy, places where the Therox Empire's control is weaker. We can regroup, figure out our next move." Xena nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. She had grown up believing the galaxy was her family's to command, that there was nowhere beyond their reach. But Leo's words reminded her of the truth she had only recently begun to understand: the galaxy was vast, filled with places her family had yet to dominate, places where resistance simmered beneath the surface, where people still fought for their freedom. And now she was one of them. Xena leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting out toward the stars. "We'll go to the outer colonies," she said, her voice firm with determination. "We'll find others like us, people who want to fight back." Leo studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers as if gauging her resolve. Then he nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I am," Xena replied, her voice unwavering. "I can't go back to the way things were. I can't live under my family's rule, knowing what I know now. We have to fight." Leo's smile faded, replaced by a look of grim understanding. "Fighting the Therox Empire won't be easy. Your family's power is vast. But if we can find the right people, build alliances, we might stand a chance." Xena nodded, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. She knew the road ahead would be dangerous, filled with challenges she couldn't yet imagine. But she also knew that she couldn't turn back. Not now. Not after everything she had done to break free. The journey to the outer colonies took days. Xena and Leo traveled through uncharted star systems, dodging patrols and evading the long reach of the Therox Empire. The further they ventured from the core worlds, the more the landscape of the galaxy changed. The gleaming spires of her family's controlled territories gave way to rugged, lawless outposts, places where the Therox name carried less weight, and where survival depended on cunning rather than status. It was in these forgotten corners of the galaxy that Xena and Leo began to find their allies. On a desolate mining colony orbiting a distant gas giant, they met Tarek, a grizzled former military officer who had once served under the Therox regime but had defected years ago, disillusioned by the Empire's corruption. Tarek had spent years hiding from the authorities, organizing small resistance cells on the fringes of the galaxy. When Xena and Leo told him their story, Tarek had listened with a skeptical eye, but there was something in Xena's defiance, in the way she spoke of her father's tyranny, that had sparked a glimmer of hope in the old soldier. "You're brave," Tarek had said after a long silence, his gaze steady on Xena's. "But bravery alone won't win this fight. You'll need people, resources, and a hell of a lot of luck." "We're not asking for your loyalty," Leo had replied, his voice calm but persuasive. "Just your help. You know people. You know how to fight. Together we can make a difference." Tarek had studied them both for a moment longer before finally nodding. "All right, I'll help. But understand this, once you start this, there's no turning back. The Therox Empire will come for you, and they won't stop until you're dead or worse." Xena had nodded, her heart filled with a steely resolve. "I know," she had said, "but I'm ready." Word of their defiance began to spread. As Xena and Leo moved from colony to colony, more and more people joined their cause. Former soldiers, rebels, smugglers, and outcasts, all those who had been wronged by the Therox Empire, who had lost loved ones to its brutality or been forced to live in the shadows of its control. Xena quickly realized that she wasn't alone in her desire for change. There were countless others who had been waiting for a chance to fight back, waiting for a leader who could rally them together. Xena had never thought of herself as a leader, but in the eyes of these rebels she represented something powerful: hope. The daughter of the most feared family in the galaxy had turned against her own, and that defiance had ignited a spark of rebellion in those who had long since lost hope. Leo, too, became a symbol of their cause. His quiet strength, his unwavering belief in the possibility of a better future, inspired those around him. He and Xena were equals in this fight, their partnership built on mutual respect and a shared determination to see the Therox Empire fall. But as their rebellion grew, so did the danger. It wasn't long before the Therox family's forces began to close in. Xena's father had mobilized his fleet, sending ships and soldiers to hunt them down, to crush the resistance before it could gain momentum. The galaxy became a battlefield, with skirmishes breaking out across the outer colonies as Xena and Leo's forces clashed with the Therox military. The resistance was vastly outnumbered, but they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. For many, this was their last chance to take back their freedom, and they were willing to give their lives for the cause. Xena led them into battle, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and adrenaline as she faced the reality of war for the first time. The battles were brutal, the losses heavy, but Xena and Leo refused to give up. They had come too far to turn back now. It was during one of these battles, on a barren moon near the edge of the galaxy, that Xena finally came face to face with her father once again. The Therox fleet had tracked their forces to the moon, and the resistance had been forced into a desperate fight for survival. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and burning metal as Xena led her forces across the battlefield, her heart pounding with fear and determination. She could hear the screams of the wounded, the roar of gunfire, but she kept moving, her mind focused on one goal: defeating the Empire. Amid the chaos, Xena saw him. Lord Therox stood at the edge of the battlefield, his dark robes billowing in the wind, his eyes cold and unfeeling as he surveyed the carnage before him. His presence was like a shadow over the battlefield, a reminder of the overwhelming power he still wielded. Xena's breath caught in her throat as their eyes met. For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. The noise of the battle faded into the background as Xena and her father stared at each other, two opposing forces locked in a silent struggle. Xena, her father's voice rang out, cold and authoritative. "This rebellion ends now." Xena's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't back down. "It won't end until the Therox Empire falls," she shouted back, her voice filled with defiance. "I won't stop until you're defeated." Lord Therox's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Xena saw a flicker of something in his gaze, anger, perhaps, or disappointment. "You've betrayed your family," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You've thrown away everything we've built. For what? For him." His gaze flicked to Leo, who stood at Xena's side, his expression hard and determined. "This isn't about Leo," Xena replied, her voice steady. "It's about freedom. It's about ending your reign of terror." Her father's lips curled into a sneer. "You're a fool, Xena. You think these people care about you? You think they'll follow you to the end? They'll turn on you the moment it benefits them." Xena's hands clenched into fists, her heart pounding with fury. "Maybe they will. But at least I'm fighting for something real. Something worth dying for." Lord Therox's expression darkened, and he took a step forward, his voice a low, menacing growl. "You will die for this, Xena. You and everyone who follows you." For a moment, Xena's heart wavered. The weight of her father's words pressed down on her, threatening to crush her resolve. But then she felt Leo's hand on her shoulder, steady and reassuring, and she remembered why she had started this fight in the first place. She had defied her father once before, and she would do it again. "I won't let you win," Xena said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Not this time." Her father's eyes burned with fury, and he raised his hand, signaling his forces to attack. The battle raged on, fierce and unrelenting. Xena and Leo fought side by side, their hearts pounding with the rhythm of war. The sky above them was filled with the thunder of ships, the ground beneath their feet shaking with the force of explosions. The Therox forces were overwhelming, but the resistance fought with a desperation born of the knowledge that this was their last stand. Xena could feel the weight of the galaxy pressing down on her, the enormity of the battle threatening to crush her spirit. But every time she thought she might falter, she looked at Leo, saw the determination in his eyes, and found the strength to keep going. The battle stretched on for hours, the losses mounting on both sides. Xena's forces were being pushed back, their lines breaking under the relentless assault of the Therox military. She could feel the tide of the battle turning, and for a moment, fear gripped her heart. But then, just when all seemed lost, a burst of light filled the sky. Xena looked up, her breath catching in her throat, as she saw a fleet of ships descending from the heavens' reinforcements. Tark and the other resistance cells had arrived, rallying to their cause in a last-ditch effort to turn the tide of the battle. Hope surged through Xena's chest as the reinforcements swooped down, engaging the Therox forces in a fierce aerial dogfight. The balance of power shifted, and slowly, the tide of the battle began to turn in their favor. Xena fought with renewed strength, her heart pounding with the knowledge that they might actually win. Hours later, the battlefield was quiet. The Therox forces had retreated, their ships fleeing into the distance as the resistance celebrated their hard-won victory. The moon's barren surface was littered with the wreckage of war, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and victory. Xena stood at the edge of the battlefield, her body aching with exhaustion, her heart filled with a mix of relief and sorrow. They had won the battle, but the cost had been high. So many lives lost, so much destruction. And yet, for the first time, Xena felt the weight of her father's empire lifting from her shoulders. Leo stood beside her, his expression grim but resolute. "We did it," he said quietly. Xena nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of pride and grief. "We did," she replied, her voice soft. "But the fight's not over." Leo's gaze met hers, and for a moment the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them, standing together in the aftermath of battle. "No," he said, his voice steady, "it's not. But we'll face it, together." Xena smiled, a small, weary smile, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope. The galaxy was vast, and the road ahead would be long. There would be more battles, more challenges, more sacrifices. But Xena knew, deep in her heart, that they had taken the first step towards something greater. The Therox Empire was crumbling, and a new order was rising from the ashes. and Xena and Leo would be there to see it. Together. As the stars stretched out before them, Xena and Leo stood side by side, their hearts filled with a quiet, determined resolve. The future was uncertain, the fight far from over, but whatever came next, they would face it together. Because now they were not just fighting for survival. They were fighting for a new galaxy. A galaxy where freedom, not tyranny, would reign.